We've reached the beginning of the hour, and I would like to welcome you today to the 6th in our series of online seminars on nanoparticles. I'm Margaret Graham, and I'm going to be hosting today. And before we start, just a reminder to keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. And if you have questions, you can type them into the chat, and we can review these at the end of Craig's presentation. You'll also have an opportunity to, if you want to switch your microphones on at that point, to ask questions. But if you can keep the microphones on mute for now. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Craig Poland from the University of Edinburgh. And he's going to give us an introduction to human applications and uses of nanoparticles. He'll also talk about resultant exposure pathways, and then a little on risk and harm prevention. Craig is currently a senior toxicologist at RCL, which is a regulatory consultancy, as well as holding the position of honorary senior fellow at the Centre for Inflammation Research here at the University of Edinburgh. His background is in particle and fibre toxicology, and over the past 15 years, he's been focusing on the potential health effects of nanomaterials. He studied a wide range of different materials, from carbon nanotubes through to metal oxides, and he's also been involved in a range of EU innovation-led projects, developing nanotechnologies and for things such as nanocomposites, graphene-based supercapacitors, and nanopackaging materials. So I'm now going to hand over to Craig to share his screen and to give his seminar.
Perfect, thank you, Margaret. I'll just see if I can share my screen. That's where I fail at the first hurdle. There we go, can we all see that?
Yes.
Perfect. So, as Margaret said, I'm going to give what I'm going to call a very, introductory sort of lecture on the applications and uses of nanomaterials. And I really stress introductory because, as I'm sure you've already kind of heard on this lecture series, the phrase nanomaterials or engineered nanomaterials even encompasses a huge array of different particles. And so to try and cover them all and their different applications it's a whole lecture series in itself. So I'm going to go through some of the key areas, and as Margaret had already mentioned, I want to give some examples of these, but how they then can maybe influence exposure pathways and then what that might mean in terms of toxicity. I'm not really going to cover toxicity down in this lecture. I believe that's been covered further down the series, but with that, I'll get started. So, applications of nanomaterials, I call this from the magical to the mundane, and that's because, especially in the early days of nanotechnology, there are various sort of headline-grabbing kind of applications of nanomaterials. The example here, this image here, is of the space elevator, and that was to use the exceptional structural properties of carbon nanotubes. They're incredibly high tensile strength, yet lightweight and hardness. And the theory here was you could use them to build a tethering rope out into orbit, so that, as it says, the space elevator, so payloads could be taken up into kind of early Earth orbit for launching satellites or whatever. So obviously a lot of interest was put into that, but it really is, to be honest, quite magical thinking. The on-paper specifications of carbon nanotubes in terms of their tensile strength, etc., doesn't always fully translate into the reality. And that's kind of a common issue with a lot of engineered nanomaterials, is that there is quite a challenge in terms of actually scaling up. So from to be able to produce small amounts of very high spec materials is one thing at a bench, but to do that in the sort of the ton or hundreds of tons or even thousands of ton amounts is quite difficult. So as I say, this is to me the more magical, whereas in terms of our actual daily exposures to carbon nanotubes, both from the perspective of humans exposure and environmental, it's more the mundane is where our exposure is likely to lie. So some of the sort of areas that, and again, we see them now coming through, are things like, you know, light but high strength structural composites, electronics, super hydrophobic coatings, food packaging, or even uses in a variety of different areas. So these more mundane aspects are where you're going to see the higher production levels of carbon nanotubes and the higher levels of application. Now, one thing I like to show, and this is a Gartner hype cycle. You can actually apply this, to be honest, to any sort of new technologies, and you can find these updated yearly from the sort of the Gartner website and other areas where they plot on it different new emerging technologies to where in the hype cycle it is, from, for example, artificial intelligence to, I think the one from last year was NFTs. So if someone could explain to me what an NFT is, I'd be really grateful, because I'm not quite sure there. So here, basically, you could actually plot different nanomaterials all along this, because obviously all nanomaterials, because it's such a breadth, are potentially in sort of different areas. So for example, here you might have very, very new levels of graphene. So there are new forms, frustratingly pronounced the same as graphene, but spelled slightly different. There's a new, more rigid form of graphene. So again, this is the sort of early stages. As we saw in terms of the space elevator, this is the kind of the peak of inflated expectations for certain nanomaterials. And then reality bites in terms of the challenges of scaling up, actually incorporation into products, the acceptance of the public to these sorts of technologies. And then you end up moving up into sort of plateau with reality. So for some materials, for example, titanium dioxide nanoparticles, which have been around for a long, long time and incorporated into numerous materials, you're very much here. For other materials, probably things like carbon nanotubes, which have still to be, you know, largely incorporated into products, you're talking more down here. And because nanotechnology is always ever evolving and developing, you've always got a new array of materials coming at this sort of level, and no doubt will be overhyped. So now, as I mentioned, nanomaterials, there's such a broad array from all your different metal oxides, your carbon-based, your dendritic polymers. There's just such an array of different materials. And these materials can obviously find a home in numerous applications, not just a single application, but obviously cross applications. And so here I've just kind of listed, not exhaustive list, but some of the main ones. So for example, electronics, composites, nanocomposites, coatings is increasingly an important area. Food in terms of food production, but also as additives and packaging, cosmetics, and increasingly medical applications. Now, I've started some of these because actually in preparing for this lecture, I had a little look around my home. As Margaret mentioned, I've been working with kind of carbon nanotubes especially, but nanomaterials for around about the last sort of 15 years. And in the early days, a lot of these kind of materials were very much at the research level. And now we are indeed seeing them in our everyday homes. When I did my PhD, a friend of mine was working on quantum dots. And again, it was in relation to cadmium quantum dots. But now you see, as I have quantum dots in my television, I have tennis rackets with titanium dioxide within them, various coatings, certainly with cosmetics. So the one that most of you will probably have in your own homes is sunscreen. So nano titanium dioxide and nano zinc oxide are very commonly added to sunscreens, which give you a high degree of UVA and UVB protection, but that nice, clear application. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through just 4 of these, because as I say, we don't have enough time to go through everything in detail, but I just want to go through 4 key applications. give an example of their uses, and take that through to the potential exposure pathways. Sorry, this is actually also just from a recent publication, ACS Nano, just giving you more of a kind of a detailed split down of the variety of applications for nanomaterials and their sort of relative parts of the sort of market. So we can see electronics is increasingly is very, very large, as is medicine and cosmetics. So I'm going to start on coatings. And there are a variety of different nanomaterials used within coatings. Some of the most common that you'll see is silver, titanium dioxide, silica, usually in the form of synthetic amorphous silica, and I've put TiO2 there twice for some reason. So this is just to give you an example of the uses, what kind of nanomaterials actually bring to the party when it comes to coatings, and why they're increasingly an important form of coating. One is a hard wearing surface, abrasion resistance, washable paints, that sort of thing. And for this, you often see things like amorphous silica nanoparticles used as an additive to form this kind of hard wearing coating. Increasingly in the time of pandemics, there is the issue of antimicrobial coatings. Silver has long been portrayed for this purpose, both in terms of hard surfaces, but also added to textiles such as socks, towels, that sort of thing, as well as things like other sort of forms of textiles such as bandages. But increasingly, we're seeing other particles being used in terms of their antimicrobial properties. So particles such as copper and zinc. And indeed, these applications, these nano applications of the antimicrobial copper of silver and copper are just utilizing what's been known for millennium, the antimicrobial properties of these materials. But when you take it down to the nano form, you have a very high surface area. It forms a nice transparent coat. And so from the perspective of being able to apply it to really any surface and provide that antimicrobial protection, the nano really is a bit of a game changer there. So you've got other properties such as anti-corrosion and sort of flow and leveling agents, again, just to improve the properties of the application, but also prevent further things like anti-corrosion. One of the most common you'll see, especially in relation to TiO2, is the use of nanomaterials in pigments, again, giving a very, very fine finish. Your standard white paint is formed to a large extent of titanium dioxide. And depending on the nature of the paint, a proportion or even a high proportion of that may also be titanium dioxide. And one area that I'm actually going to touch on a little bit here is what we call self-cleaning or even anti-pollution coatings, in part because I find them very, very interesting, because they can actually contribute to some of the remediation of pollution, as opposed to, as many of these do, cause concerns as to the level of potential release of nanomaterials from these coatings. So here, the example I'm going to give is titanium dioxide. Now, as I've said, I mean, titanium dioxide, just to put it in perspective, when we look at the kind of the production levels of different nanomaterials, for quite a number of them, it's still very much a niche area. You're talking, several tons of the material kind of across, for example, the EU per year. Whereas when you start to look at something like titanium dioxide, you're really, really talking very kind of industrial production levels. And that is because, production levels are driven by the demand. And it's a useful material. As I've already mentioned, it can be used in pigments. Here, it can also be used in self-cleaning surfaces. So in this case, nanomaterials, nano TiO2, can be applied to a range of different materials. So often you'll see it applied to glasses, so for self-cleaning glasses, but it's also applied to things like cement and textiles. So here, the reason why it's applied is that TiO2 due to its band gap energy width, can actually lead to the formation of free radicals that help degrade dirt and various forms of pollution. So you can understand why this is very useful in terms of application to a window, because it's the ultraviolet light, the sunlight exposure that that basically causes the formation of these charge carriers, so the hole and the subsequent electron. Now, it's this hole that reacts with absorbed water to form hydroxyl radicals. So these are incredibly short-lived but incredibly reactive radicals. And this electron that's pushed up into the higher conductance band also reacts with molecular oxygen and forms superoxide. Now, these free radicals both can work to degrade dirt particles, but very, very interestingly and importantly, they can degrade other pollutants such as VOCs, nitrogen dioxide, but all can also be used for the perspective of antimicrobial surfaces. So, as I mentioned, whilst you'll often see these in relation to glasses, usually combined with a super hydrophobic layer, so the dirt particles, once degraded, are washed off when it rains. So you've got effectively a self-cleaning glass, but they're also applied to non-hydrophobic sort of and rough materials like cement in the sorts of built environment, again, to try and address urban air pollution issues. So now, one of the issues with coating, obviously, there is a lot of different uses, but there'll be certain sort of common exposure pathways. And for coatings, just as with any nanomaterials, we don't want to just focus on the kind of the in-use time. You also want to kind of consider the sort of the life cycle and the sort of varying potential for different forms of exposure and different levels of exposure during that. So in terms of coating uses, typically inhalation is a big risk during the manufacture of the material. If you think of a compound such as titanium dioxide, you've got the production of the titanium dioxide particles, you've got its packaging, it will then be shipped to the producer of whatever technology is being used, whether that's a pigment manufacturer or someone developing glass coatings. But ultimately, the TiO2 needs to be unpacked, incorporated into a new product, and so on and so forth. So during that handling, you've got the potential for inhalation exposure. And also, if you've got coatings on nano-based coatings on a composite or a compound, for example, then potentially you've got the opportunity for inhalation during the sort of cutting and the shaping of these materials with nano coatings. Skipping toward the end of the life cycle, then you've also got the issue of recycling, whether that's been milling or grinding. Again, you've got the potential there for inhalation exposure. Excuse me. Now, in terms of dermal exposures, that's the other kind of main area when we consider coatings. Again, as above, during the manufacture, especially the sort of bulk powders, you've got the potential for handling issues, dermal exposure. But in terms of you and I, during our day-to-day life interacting with these surfaces, you've got the potential for, surface abrasion of these coatings during the lifetime use. Now, as you can imagine, the level of release from such a coating from dermal abrasion is likely to be relatively low. Let's face it, it would be a pretty poor coating if it immediately rubbed off when we were in contact with it. But nevertheless, it is a potential source of exposure. So I'm going to move on to sort of cosmetics. Now, cosmetics is, again, an area where nanomaterials have been used for actually quite some time, but in perhaps a slightly broader form of nanomaterials. So here is a nice example of different forms of nanomaterials. So these are not specifically types, so we're not talking amorphous silica or whatever, we're talking just different forms. So nanoemulsions, liposomes, niosomes, things like that. You've got your relatively insoluble nanomaterials, and that's kind of one of the ways you can look at this, is the kind of the more soluble sort of nano carriers, as we would call them, and the kind of the more insoluble nanoparticles, nanotube, nanoparticles, etc. And then dendrimers, which are effectively branched sort of polymeric molecules, which can be used in terms of a film forming agent when applied to the skin, or can actually be used to sort of, again, as a carrier for payloads. So generally, nanomaterials here are kind of used to improve the product performance. So that might be how it feels, its sort of level of absorption, things like that, as well as improve the sort of stability and the shelf life. So that might be encapsulating active ingredients to prevent their degradation over time. So now the formulation types. So here we'd call, the type of excipient, whether or not it's an oil-based or an aqueous-based. There's other aspects in there that are there to help, promote uptake and penetration. Key issues are issues such as the sort of size and the charge of the nanoparticulates or emulsions can really have a significant effect on the sort of level of dermal penetration. So as I've already mentioned, you have things like nanocarriers. So you've got things like solid lipid nanoparticles, liposomes, emulsions. And one of the things that they're often used is to actually aid the penetration. The skin is actually very, very good at its job, and that is one of its jobs is to prevent the sort of penetration of outside particulates, dirt, microbes especially. And so you've got your stratum corneum, which is a layer of dead skin cells, which forms a formidable barrier. And it's these sorts of nanocarriers which can actually help penetrate past the stratum corneum into the sort of the live active skin. And one area that it's used to reduce toxicity is for the delivery of things like retinal gel, so that's vitamin A. If you apply that directly to the skin, it can actually cause irritation, whereas if it's incorporated into things like these carrier particles, then it enables the penetration to the point of delivery. These particles degrade quite rapidly and then release their payload where it can have the effect. So it very much reduces the level of irritation. Now, it's one thing to bear in mind is I haven't really touched upon here, but is the definition of nanomaterials. So there's obviously a focus on the size. So in a lot of different environments, nanoparticles are defined as being a particle being under 100 nanometers. One thing to bear in mind is that that definition has no basis in toxicology whatsoever. To be honest, I don't think it has a basis in any science. It really is just more of a case of it's a useful line in the sand. There isn't a step change between 105 nanometers and 95 nanometers, certainly not from a toxicological perspective. But in other areas, there are further kind of defining parameters. And in cosmetics, a nanomaterial specifically refers to an insoluble or biopersistent unintentionally manufactured material. So in that respect, these nanocarriers are in a bit of a gray area when we consider the sort of presence or absence of nanomaterials in cosmetics. So insoluble nanomaterials are generally, through kind of my look at through the literature, and that was a piece of work we did quite a few years ago for the Danish Environmental Protection Agency, who were very interested in the potential human exposures to nanocarriers, but also solid nanoparticles. And it is these solid nanoparticles, such as titanium dioxide, such as silicon, which are generally pretty much hindered in their penetration in the skin. And I'm going to give you one example of such a use of such a material. This is probably the most common example, which I touched upon earlier, and that's the use of nano titanium dioxide or zinc oxide in skin. Now, when I was a kid and my mum took me to the beach, she'd slather me in sunscreen and I'd be pasty white. It would be a thick white layer. Whereas now, when I apply sunscreen to my own kids, I've still got a protection factor of 50, 60, but it's a thin, non-greasy, transparent layer. And the reason being is because of the particle size. So here we have the example between the coarse particles, which is the sort of thing was used when I was a child, or chemical filters. In case of the the coarse particles, not only are they visible because they're quite large, but the level of protection is not great, because again, the gaps between the particles, the UV rays can actually penetrate towards the skin to a relative degree. So you do need quite a thick layer before you actually get that level of barrier protection. Now, with the nanomaterials, due to their very small size, high surface area, you've got a high degree of reflection of the sun's rays. So again, you require a thinner layer, but you still have this excellent barrier protection. Now, this has caused a variety of different concerns. For one, you've got the potential for particles penetrating into the skin. And as I've mentioned before, the evidence around that is actually that they don't penetrate that well. But the other, as we discussed a moment ago in relation to coatings, is that titanium dioxide is photoreactive. And there have been incidents, for example, where you see, and it was in Australia, and it was these sort of plastic roofing, the kind of corrugated roofing, failing after a few years of regular use. And one of the things that was found was it was sunscreen on the hands of the fitters that effectively acted as an initiation point. You were getting degrading of the plastic coating due to the reactivity in of the titanium dioxide particles with the sun's rays, degrading the material, leading to a crack formation. And that's been an area of study to look as to whether or not, again, oxidative stress or oxidant production from these particles may actually influence toxicity. So in terms of the cosmetic uses and the exposure sort of pathways, obviously that's quite clear. I mean, the main use of these materials is that they're applied directly to the skin purposefully. But obviously you'll also have the potential for mucous membranes being applied to those either accidentally or, depending on the nature of the product, intentionally. And the sort of barrier protection levels of a mucous membrane is somewhat different to that of the skin. Inhalation is potentially an exposure pathway, depending again on the application. If it's used in a spray, for example, a deodorant, I'm not aware of any spray applications thus far, but looking to the future. And then again, you've got potential accidental ingestion due to skin, people applying, for example, sunscreen to your hands. You've got the potential for secondary ingestion. So to kind of door back onto that issue in terms of the potential for dermal penetration, I just very quickly want to cover a study done some years ago now by NIOSH in the US, looking at dermal penetration of titanium dioxide nanoparticles. So this is obviously a nice diagram of the sort of the skin, and one of the key things that the particles have got to get through is this layer of dead skin cells. So this is really the sort of the true barrier level before you're actually getting through to live cells, where there can be a degree of interaction, and you've got the potential for either toxicity in these sorts of layers, or if it moves past the basement membrane, distribution and its systemic exposure in the body. But the big is if it can get through this layer. So in this study, they applied titanium dioxide at 5% by weight, which is actually a relatively high amount. From what I understand, typically you'd see materials like titanium dioxide or other nanoparticles used probably lower levels than sort of 2.5%. So this was done in a formulation of sunscreen and applied at a dose of 2 mg per of the cream per centimetre of skin, 4 applications per day, 5 days a week over 5 weeks. So that's actually quite an exposure. Well, here in the UK, that's a huge exposure. That's probably the equivalent of 5 years of exposure for me, because we don't really get much sun. But in other environments, and especially workers outside, that might be more akin to a normal day or a normal period. So one of the things they found was the vast majority of particles applied to the skin didn't penetrate past this uppermost layer of the skin. and there was no detection of the titanium dioxide elsewhere in the body. So they looked at sentinel organs, so organs that you would expect to pick up and accumulate particles, such as the liver and the spleen. And what that suggests is that very little, if any, particles become bloodborne. So this is the cross section. So we've got the stratum corneum up here. So this is the dead layer. So most of the particles sat on top of this layer and didn't penetrate in. So when you're talking penetration, we're talking nanoparticles here. So when you're talking such very small numbers, you're talking a vanishingly small dose. But obviously, as I mentioned, you can get different formulations, etc., that can be developed to actually improve penetration, should that be desirable. So you never know quite what the future's going to hold. So food. So there's a variety of different applications in food, and I've kind of split these up into sort of agriculture. So you've got things like fertilizers, agrochemical delivery, new antimicrobials or pesticides, soil remediation, pathogen detection, that sort of thing. I believe you already had lectures on agriculture, which is great because I'm not going to cover that at all. But so we've got the sort of the production of foods or food materials, and then you take that forward into sort of processing. So you'll have things like anti-caking agents, such as often used as things like synthetic amorphous silica. You might have nano-encapsulation, again, to either to promote longevity of the product or preserve nutrients, for example. And you'll have one aspect of some nano-emulsions. I mean, one of the natural nano-emulsion, to a certain extent, is milk. You know, it's got tiny micelles of the lipids within their sort of aqueous phase, and that's what milk and things like ice cream is. But these might be manufactured to, again, improve the distribution of the product, the homogeneity, things like that. You're taking that forward, you might to the sort of product. So this more relates to things like the packaging. Again, often important in today's world where you've got materials being shipped, or food products being shipped around the world, so they need to be able to last. So one aspect is UV protection, but increasingly you've got things like antimicrobial surfaces, such as silver incorporated into packaging to prevent pathogens growing, such as salmonella. Another area you've got, one which I'm going to cover just here, is high barrier plastics. And again, this is things like the use of nanoclays incorporated into the sort of plastic coatings, especially for things like fizzy drinks. So you're preventing either gas loss or moving in. And then you've also got the potential, I've not really seen this so much yet, but contaminant sensors. So nanoparticles developed that will either change color or in some other way let you know that there is a contaminant present and that food should be disposed of. And then increasingly we see the use of nanoparticles in terms of nutritions. So that might be used as a sort of fortifying agent within foodstuffs to kind of promote, for example, uptake, or maybe used in other areas. And one thing that's being kind of pushed is the use of certain nanomaterials in terms of water purification, such as carbon nanotubes or graphene in sort of desalination. So to take this kind of example of the barrier plastics, is the development, and this a project I worked on quite some time ago actually, which was looking at developing polymer nanocomposites. So it was a range of different nanoclays, things like bentonite and montmorillonite, which were used and incorporated into different polymers, dispersed and then extruded into sort of thin films. And the idea with this is the incorporation of these plate-like nanoclays, and you can use also silicates as well, is that creates a more tortuous path for water vapor, oxygen, etc., to either go from the outside into the product or more likely, if you're talking something like a carbonated drink, I think it's incorporated into to plastic bottles for beer, is to actually prevent the kind of the progressive leak of carbon dioxide from the products, leading to a flat drink. So ultimately, what this does is it just increases the sort of the shelf life, and in that respect, reduces waste. But there are a range of different materials that have been sort of suggested or have been incorporated into such sort of polymers to increase their performance. Obviously, just as with any other aspect of the application of nanomaterials, you have to think about cost and also ease of incorporation and use. If you've got a nanomaterial that's incredibly expensive, then typically you're not going to see that incorporated into many everyday products because the price point would be completely off. Typically, also, if you're going to consider incorporating nanomaterials into a production process, you want to be able to do that doesn't require you starting from scratch with the production process. So, for example, being able to start with a master batch of a precursor with, for example, the nanomaterial already incorporated in with the polymer that can then be placed into a standard production line. You know, that's obviously going to be much more attractive because it doesn't require starting from scratch. So, food uses and exposure pathways. So, as I tried to touch on with that 4-point diagram, there are a wide range of uses. So, as a result, there's multiple pathways, and that really depends on how it's being used, what part of the sort of the life cycle, the product life cycle, and so on. So, in terms of food, obviously you've got the gastrointestinal tract. So you've got the intentional ingestion of nanofood additives, such as capsules, nutraceuticals. I mean, for example, you've got things like titanium dioxide and synthetic amorphous silica are approved food additives used either to improve the kind of the flow or the feel of the foods, or as colorants, for example. So you've got a degree of intentional ingestion there, but you've also got the potential for incidental ingestion. So here is the consideration of potential leaching of particles from the packaging, and how that might be enhanced or changed depending on the foodstuff. So, for example, a low pH food is more likely to sort of draw and dissolve certain forms of nanoparticles than a more neutral pH foodstuff. And then, as we've already mentioned, you've got the agricultural activity. So you've got the potential for both dermal and inhalation exposure through activities such as spraying or just, again, handling these sorts of products. And then in terms of the end of life, the recycling of, again, for example, food packaging, you've got the potential there for human exposure as well. So this is my last of my examples, and to a certain extent, I've kind of saved the best to last. Although, to be honest, for most of us, it's these other kind of applications that we're most likely to be exposed. Nanomedicine obviously generally suggests some form of treatment, and so I'm hoping none of us ever require these sorts of nanomedicines. But there are a variety of different areas in which nanotechnology can really be used to great effect within medicine, and here the range of uses is really rather broad. So this is just to kind of help break it up a little bit. So you've got, for example, the sort of diagnostic uses, and you've got also therapeutic uses and how they may be also used to kind of support in terms of vaccine delivery and immunization. Sometimes these two are combined together in the field of what they term theranostics. The idea being here that you can actually use nanoparticles as, for example, an imaging agent to sort of detect and diagnose, for example, a cancer, but then use that same technology at the same time to then deliver a payload of, for example, a chemotherapeutic drug. So you've actually got a combination of a diagnostic application and at the same time a therapeutic application. So as I mentioned, imaging agents, and one of the key areas here is things like high contrast agents for things like MRI. Typically you'd use other substances like gadolinium or barium oxide, again as a contrast agent, but these are not always quite so good at showing, for example, tumors in hard to kind of reach areas. So one area that you'll see, for example, nanoparticles being increasingly used is as a contrast agent for things like the central nervous system. And again, this is where their small size and high kind of contrast properties really excel. Cancer diagnosis, again, and I'll touch on some imaging modalities for that. But one of the other options you've got, or suggested uses of nanomaterials, is again how they can actually be used as almost a sentinel to kind of detect the presence of pathogens. So, for example, bacteria in the lungs or whatever, that again can aid in diagnosis. Certainly within therapeutics, you've got disease and sort of cancer treatment. Cancer treatment especially is one of the areas that nanomaterials are often used. And here you've got the kind of the approach is usually from the perspective of encapsulation of chemotherapies. So these are obviously highly cytotoxic drugs. You want to be able to keep them ideally into the circulation for longer, so they don't end up in tissues where you don't want them. And again, ideally you want to be able to target them to specifically to tumors to reduce sort of systemic unintended effects. And that's where, again, nanotechnology can be employed. You've also got the potential for using things like carbon nanotubes and other nanostructures in tissue engineering, for example, to encourage bone regrowth, or used in prosthetics. And again, due to the ability for nanoparticles to penetrate through cells and be incorporated, they can also be used in terms of gene therapies. In terms of immunization, there's different approaches here. Again, you've got certain forms of nanoparticles through their increased reactivity due to small size, increased surface area, can make great adjuvants and help really stimulate that immune response that can help in terms of the vaccination, but it can also be used in terms of controlled delivery. Again, actually, rather than just releasing for example, the protein of interest into the body as a one kind of single shot, by encapsulation and slow release, you can extend the period of exposure, giving the body more time to mount an immune response, and again improving the vaccine delivery. So this is, I think, up to date as of 2020. So basically, one of the things you have got to consider when we think about the medical uses of nanomaterials is, as with any therapeutic, you've got quite a high degree of testing that is required before a therapeutic can become approved. Now, obviously, that differs between whether or not in this case, nanomaterial is considered to be a therapeutic, so akin to a drug, or whether or not it's considered to be a medical device. The level of testing and sort of thing to go through for that can be quite different. But at the time, then, over sort of 27 different nanomaterials have been approved by the US FDA or the European medical agencies for use. And there's obviously many, many more at different stages of investigation, be that, blue sky thinking in terms of bench science, all the way through to sort of clinical and human trials. So here's a few small examples in terms of the sort of medical uses. So as I've mentioned, many of the therapies are actually nano encapsulations of pre-approved agents. Danuglipron is a chemotherapeutic, but also other approaches are in terms of contrast agents. So one is that's been used for quite some time actually is ultra small paramagnetic iron oxide nanoparticles. And typically these are used as MRI contrast agents for tumor and vascular visualization. Very good for looking at things like liver tumors, but in terms of the vascular, as I mentioned before, due to their sort of small size and high contrast, they're very good for looking at more tricky areas such as the central nervous system. Another, due to their magnetic properties, is there's been suggestion and developments in terms of using these materials to actually target specific areas. So using magnetic fields to actually cause an accumulation in a specific tissue. And depending on how you want to use that sort of property, you can have drugs, for example, conjugate to the surface that can then be sort of triggered to release at that kind of accumulated point. Or you've also got the potential, for example, of thermal therapies to sort of treat tumors. Another version here is hafnium oxide. So this is a treatment here, and which has obviously got the very, very rolls off your tongue name of MBTXR3, which is actually hafnium oxide, which is directly injected into solid tumors. And due to the properties of hafnium oxide, especially in the nano form, it acts as a radioenhancer. So when they apply the external radiotherapy, it absorbs more radiation. And so what that means is you have an increase in local radiation, specifically at the tumor site, leading to greater levels of radiation-mediated cell death. So it's more effective in that respect, but the knock-on effect of that is that you then require a overall smaller dose to achieve a significant effect. So you've got the potential for reduced side effects. And this is another sort of completely different approach. So I'll try to pick 3 examples that have very different kind of approaches in terms of nanomedicine. So this one is a lipid nanoparticle based delivery system, specifically targeting the liver. And what it is delivering to the liver is a small interfering RNA, which effectively switches off the protein production of transthyretin, because what you've got in this disease situation is, due to a gene mutation, is a misfolded form of the protein, which leads to disease. So by using the lipid nanoparticle-based system, they can get this sRNA specifically to the tissues that they require in a high level that can then help silence that protein production. So similar in relation to my slides on the sort of food production, is here we have the issue of multiple uses and multiple pathways. So obviously you've got intravenous, which is the most common for therapeutics. So as I've mentioned, imaging agents, drug delivery, that sort of thing. You've also got the potential for implantation. So if you do need, for example, a tissue scaffold, or for example, another area would be stents in the vasculature, prosthetics. Again, it's a different delivery, more localized, but again, a source of potential exposure. Inhalation is again a normal, another route through drug delivery, for example, directly treating the lungs, imaging, that sort of thing, and similar with gastrointestinal tract and dermal. Now, one of the things that marks the medical aspects out compared to the other uses of nanomaterials is, due to the very direct and controlled nature of these medical interventions, exposure will be well characterized, and due to the high degree of regulation to avoid harm, those levels shouldn't really exceed the point where harm could be done. So I just want to finish up on a little bit about risk and harm prevention. Now, this is my area obviously is toxicology, and one of my big passions is occupational health and the prevention of disease. Working in the Centre for Inflammation Research, there's a lot of researchers trying to find curative approaches to various disease, whereas in my view, if we can prevent it, that's where we should go. And this is where this nice quote comes in: an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Now, from that, you might ask the question of, are nanomaterials toxic, or are they safe? Now, to be honest, that's relatively a meaningless question on two levels, without context. Firstly, you've got the question of nanomaterials. Are nanomaterials safe? Well, there's such a huge range of nanomaterials. It's like saying, are chemicals safe? You know, some chemicals are safer than others. Some are extremely, extremely toxic, whereas some are extremely benign. And the same can be said for nanomaterials. So there needs to be that degree of specificity there. And to say whether or not something is toxic or not, again, is meaningless without context, because you always have to talk about that in relation to dose. Ultimately, everything is toxic, whether that be water or whatever. You just need a high enough dose. So you always need to talk about toxicity, or in this case, safety, in relation to the potential for exposure, the potential for dose, and then obviously the sort of hazardous properties. So that's just something to sort of think about when you see these sorts of questions put out. Now, one of the things that I like the quotation that those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. And so when we consider new technologies or emerging technologies, it is useful to look to the past and the lessons that we either have learned or we should learn. So, I mean, obviously from an environmental perspective, there's lots of examples of at their time, newly developed chemicals that with experience later proved to be harmful and are still huge problems today. From the human perspective, I like to turn to asbestos. Now, growing up, for me, asbestos was always skull and crossbones, always, you know, this horrible blight causes a huge number of deaths. But in its day, you know, if we go back 100 years, 130 years ago, asbestos was a wonder material. It was widely used because it was incredibly useful due to its flexibility. You could incorporate it into textiles, into cement, into all sorts of structures. It's fireproof, chemical proof. It was incredibly resilient. And so here we have an example of an advertisement. Turner & Newall with the big asbestos company in the UK. So there's Lady Asbestos with her asbestos shields under the gods of shipbuilding, engineering, construction, electricity, which shows you some of the key applications of asbestos in its time. So it was widely, but as it turned out, inappropriately used. And here's one example. This is crystal asbestos. And this was marketed as asbestos snow. So you would go at Christmas time, buy packets of this and scatter it all over your Christmas tree to give you this nice Christmassy effect. You look at films such as Bing Crosby's White Christmas, where it starts snowing. That was someone above him scattering crystal asbestos. Again, it was at that time, it was a useful material and they didn't understand the health effects. So, and once that even was start to be understood, the regulation and banning of these materials was very slow to sort of catch up. The result is globally, you've got 239,000 deaths were attributable to occupational exposure to asbestos in 2019. Now that's against the backdrop of all forms of asbestos being banned by 1999 in the UK at least. So you again have these situations where new technologies that were incredibly useful at the time have been employed without proper understanding of the potential hazards and risks. And again, that's one thing that we obviously want to avoid when it comes to things like nanomaterials. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that nanomaterials are like these. I'm saying that we need to be sure that they're not like these and use them appropriately. So I just want to kind of finish up on a consideration of risk assessment. Now, continuing with the asbestos example, because it is a very, very well documented example of how not to do something. this is a timeline for asbestos going over a sort of 120-year period. So at the start, we have the first reports of health effects of in workers exposed to asbestos. And then over time, what we had was increasing reports of health effects from lung scarring through to mesothelioma, which is a cancer. And then further on, later, we started to see regulations to control exposure to asbestos, and then the toxicological studies to understand what the toxicity was, eventual banning. And even now, and these are some of the studies that I've been involved with, we're still trying to understand the key toxicological mechanisms that drives the toxicity of asbestos. And this is, 100, 120 years after the problem's been known that it does cause disease. So ultimately, you can break that down into sort of 3 stages. So first was the population health effects. Once that was recognized, they tried the exposure control, and then we had the toxicological characterization. Now, when you're looking at prevention of disease, that's back to front. Ultimately, and the kind of the approach now within regulation, especially things like REACH, where the mantra is no data, no market, is you're looking at switching those. So you have a new material, such as nanomaterials, you properly characterize them from a toxicological perspective. Again, whether that be looking at mammalian models, looking to human toxicity, or environmental models to understand things like their fate behavior and toxicity to different organisms. Once you've got that, then you can place, use these materials appropriately. If there's concerns, they may not be permitted to be used, or they might require additional exposure controls or whatever, but you know the problem, you control the exposure with a view that you can try to prevent any population health effects. So again, a more sensible approach to a more proactive approach to risk evaluation. So because I'm almost up to time, I have a few more slides, but I think I'll leave it at that because we've covered quite a lot. So thank you very much for your attention, and I shall now try and work out how I stop sharing. There we go, I did it. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you so much, Craig. That was a really great introduction to the wide range of uses across like surfaces and cosmetics, food technologies, and the range even just of medical uses as well. And yes, it's really, really good to just get some understanding of the intentional, but also the accidental pathways where these nanomaterials can get into the human body. There's clearly tremendous benefits from some of these new nanomedical technologies, but you've also made us think about the need to evaluate any potential negative impacts and the things that we might just not know about at the current time. So thank you very much for that. I think I can see that there are already some questions coming into the chat. I don't know if you can see these, but we have one, first of all, from Virginia. So first of all, thanking you for your presentation. Question is about titanium oxide used in sunscreen causing toxicity to the skin due to their photocatalytic properties. I believe they are coated or capped, but still, is there any potential risk?
The thing about risk, to a certain extent, is obviously there is a balance to be had. There has actually been quite a few studies looking both at the potential for dermal absorption, because that's one aspect, is the passage into the body, or at least down into the sort of viable cell layers, and typically they've shown there is some transfer, but very, very low levels. Obviously, that differs in the nature of if you've got a barrier compromised skin, so you've got a cut, or one area of concern is, for example, if you've got sunburned skin and you're applying these substances to the skin, whether or not that can increase. But ultimately, the level of penetration is very, very low. In terms of the photocatalytic properties, that is obviously the nature of titanium dioxide. You can use different forms. So there's, for example, anatase, rutile, or a mix, and they actually differ in their level of photoreactivity. But from what I've understood from the various studies that have been conducted, whilst there is photoreactivity, you've got to remember they're on the surface of layers and layers and layers of dead skin. So they're not actually in contact with the sort of viable skin where they may cause specific cellular damage. So from that perspective, the risk is relatively low. As you mentioned in that, they could be coated or capped. I'm always dubious about coatings. There was always because coatings can degrade, they can sometimes be not perfect. So for me, it's risky to rely on coatings. But as I say, the potential for reactivity towards a dead cell layer is low. And ultimately, it comes down to the balance. You're better off using something like a very effective sunscreen than going out with no sunscreen where you know where you are going to have significant issues. So at the moment, certainly within Europe, and it's been evaluated by the SCCS Scientific Committee on Consumer, I keep forgetting what the S is, have evaluated TiO2 and zinc oxide sunscreens and effectively given them, so that they're okay to use. And if I remember correctly, I think the level of nanomaterials in those were up to sort of 2.5%, which is quite a high level.
Thank you very much. And then we have another question from Ian Oliver. So again, thanking you for your presentation. The question is on nanos in packaging. The movement away from single-use plastic packaging, has this influenced research into the inclusion of nanomaterials in packaging? Can nanomaterials help with this movement?
I don't know whether or not it's influenced. I think there is always an influence, because obviously whatever new technology, especially in things like food packaging that's being developed, has to address the consumer or the industrial demand. And as you say in your message, the demand is for less single use and more reusable packaging. So certainly the nature of the kind of the benefits that the use of different nanomaterials can bring to packaging. So key ones are going to be the aspects such as the antimicrobial coatings. One thing that is quite impressive that I've seen as well is the coatings on, for example, the inside of bottles. You know, for example, like a mayonnaise bottle, whereas previously, you know, you'd squirt it out and the mayonnaise would be coating the bottle, whereas now you turn upside down and it all flows to the bottom. So you've got less food waste, easier to clean, and potentially, I'm not saying they would at the moment because of the nature of single-use plastics, but could potentially, you know, make it more akin to be reused, and that is due to a super hydrophobic coating on the surface, again, which using things like TiO2 or synthetic amorphous silica can provide. So I do think there is certainly a lot of benefit to using nanotechnology to try and improve packaging reuse, but as with many areas, I think there needs to be obviously public acceptance, but an appreciation of that, an allowance for that in things like regulation or whatever that can enable some materials that might not traditionally be recycled, reused to be used like that.
Thank you. And I just have a couple of questions. I know we're a little bit over time, but just a couple of quick questions. So you talked about the approved nanomedicines. I think there were 27 of them at the current time. And you talked about it takes time to get these approved. Are nanomedicines any different from all the other kinds of drugs that we use? Is it the same approval process? Does it take the same amount of time? Or there are added complexities for nanomaterials and nanomedicines?
From what I understand, it's effectively the same process. Obviously, you need to highlight the fact that there's nano, and it's, to be honest, it's the same across a lot of different areas of regulation. You need to be specific about the fact that it's a nanomaterial, but ultimately, the sort of the tests that are employed, and I assume this is what regulators have done themselves, but when I look at it from a toxicity perspective, I have to think: is there any reason why, if I put a nanomaterial into that test system, that I wouldn't see an effect that would later sort of come to fruition? So, for example, if I'm looking for carcinogenic effects, you apply these materials to the animal, you leave it for its full life, and then you look for tumor formation, as a standard sort of carcinogenicity assay. Is there any reason to think that a nanomaterial would behave in such a way that wouldn't allow you to detect carcinogenicity in that case? Mm-hmm. Often it's no. Yeah. In terms of where you do need adaptation to address nanomaterials, is not often from the perspective of looking at, biological, toxicological effects. It's often things like understanding the characterizing the materials, things like that, and how you kind of apply the dose or whatever. So, and not just medicine, but I think in a lot of areas, that's where there's a lot of efforts to try and sort of catch up and develop new standards and new guidelines that are fully appropriate for nanomaterials, or at least confirm that they are indeed, the ones that are there are actually useful for nanomaterials.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then I can see another question's come into the chat. So Doug Evans was referring back to one of our previous lectures where it was stated that naturally occurring nanoparticles are much more prevalent in the environment relative to engineered ones. Can you estimate for foods the relative importance of man-made versus natural particles?
That's a really good question. I completely agree with the natural versus engineered, and to be honest, it's a kind of it's a slight hobby horse of mine, is that I don't really care when it comes to nanomaterials whether or not they're engineered or natural. Ultimately, it comes down to what properties they have, whether that be shape, surface charge, etc. So the production method, whether it's coming out of a diesel engine or a factory or a volcano, it doesn't really matter to me. Ultimately, I'm interested in what properties it has. In terms of the relative importance of man-made versus natural particles, I guess you've got to ask yourself what sort of particles are going to be in the food and what are their properties. So if you're talking natural particles, as I already mentioned, if you're looking at something like a pint of milk, where you've got these nanostructured, nano-sized micelles of lipids, that's natural. We've been exposed to it forever. Now that might be quite different to, for example, nanosilver leaching from the bottle into the milk. So you've kind of got to consider not just the prevalence of natural versus engineered, but what properties do they bring? So as with all of these things, it's hard to kind of delve too much into it without a specific example.
Yes, it's such a fascinating area. There's so much to discuss. And I reckon we could probably keep asking questions and having more discussion for quite some time. Is there anyone else wanting to ask a question just now?
I mean, I put my email address up there at the end, so if anyone does have any other queries or anything like that, then honestly, please feel free to drop me an email. I'm more than happy to respond and to talk about this more.
Excellent, thank you so much. I've maybe have a few questions for you later, but yeah, let's just thank Craig again for an excellent presentation and for answering the very wide-ranging questions so far. And as I say, if you want to reach out to Craig and have further discussion, then you can look for his details later. And then also the last thing that I'm going to do before we finish today is just to hope that you will join us again next week and for the few weeks after. Next week, we'll welcome Professor Holger Hintelmann from Trent University, and he's going to be talking about nanoparticle biogeochemistry and specifically about their fate and transport in aquatic systems. So I hope that you will join us next week, and perhaps also tell more people about the seminar series. They can have a look online at the lectures that have gone by, and then hopefully maybe join us next week as well. So thank you very much again, Craig, and I hope to see everyone again next week.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.